Chapter 22. Juan Flynn had difficulty sleeping at night. He knew too much. Charlie had told him things. While we asked him what things, Juan remained evasive, preferring to keep his knowledge to himself, thinking that, perhaps as I had, by disclosing such information, he could only spread fear. Juan suspected Charlie of many things, but he wanted to be sure. He was like that, the kind of person who comes to his own conclusions. I always admired Juan for that quality. We all did. Also, having a 6'5" Vietnam vet on our side was reassuring. Still, Juan's insomnia permitted only intermittent rest, and he spent hours with a shotgun sitting on a hillside outside the ranch house, on patrol, Crockett used to call it. We were staying in the bunkhouse then, the four of us on cots in one small room. At night, we'd play bridge and games in concentration. Sometimes Juan talked about his Panamanian mother, who knew voodoo. She have, my mother, strong powers to keep these spirits under control. One day I walk out the street in front of my home and find a dagger stuck in the ground, and my mother tell me not to touch, that it keep away the locura. How you say, craziness. Following my episode with Charlie in the canyon, Juan put a shotgun on nails above his bunk. By that time, Crockett had convinced him to try to sleep. We got a psychic umbrella around the ranch. It's there. Soon as anyone enters that area, we'll wake up. Ain't no way Charlie's gonna sneak up on us. One night, about 2 o'clock, he tried it. We were all asleep, bundled up in sleeping bags. The nights had turned cold. We had a small wood-burning stove set up in one corner. I was awakened by Juan thrashing around in bed, talking in his sleep. Crockett and Poston were also awakened. We lay there, watching and listening to Juan. "You son of a bitch," he muttered. "You motherfucker. Okay, I got you. I got you. No, you ain't getting away. There, I'm in your lung. Now burn. I'm burning real good." Juan's legs flailed inside the sleeping bag, his body dangling over the edge of the bunk at both ends. Finally, his foot struck the shotgun, and it fell on top of him. When he opened his eyes, I was looking straight at him from my bed, just adjacent to his. Across the room, Crockett lay there, wide awake on his bunk. Brooks was already sitting up. "What's going on, Juan?" "I got him," Juan muttered. "It's Charlie, ain't it? He's sneaking up on us out there." "Yeah, but I got him good. I burned in there, in his lung." "It's Charlie and somebody else," Crockett said. "I got him," Juan repeated, his voice still groggy. "Yeah, but he's still coming," I said. Crockett sat up. "He may be coming, but by the time he gets here, he's going to be so wiped out, he won't be able to do much." Juan slipped out of the bag and climbed down from the bed. He picked up the shotgun and checked the chamber before setting the weapon on top of the bunk. Then he walked to the door and went onto the porch. Seconds later, we heard him. "Hi, Charlie. What you looking for?" Charlie's response was unintelligible. Then we heard Juan. "And you too, Clem, you sneaky motherfucker. I know you're out there. And you, Bruce Cabro." Charlie followed Juan inside the bunkhouse. Charlie was white. He looked totally disoriented. Crockett grinned, lit a cigarette, and offered one to Charlie. Kinda late for a social call, ain't it? Charlie wore buckskins and carried a leather thong over his shoulder. One of these nights I'm gonna sneak up on you motherfuckers, he said evenly, forcing a grin, still trying to regain his composure. And when I do... Now that's impossible, Crockett said. Ain't no such thing as sneaking up on people. You know it, and I know it. All that sneaking up is just make-believe. Something people do to keep up a little intrigue in their lives. Yeah, I added. You taught us too well. Charlie grinned, and some of the color returned to his face. Yeah, well, you folks just sleep tight. He turned and walked out the door, and Juan called after him. Hey, Charlie, next time, cabron, there ain't gonna be no next time. 2 nights later, we all woke up simultaneously. Charlie, Brooks said, creepy-crawly. Son of a bitch! He don't give up, does he? Crockett sat up and reached for his shirt. I put on my pants, then hopped back up on the bunk. Juan's shotgun was under my sleeping bag. I tossed it to Juan. We were all sitting up and Crockett was smoking a cigarette when Charlie pushed the door open and came crawling in on his hands and knees. Hi, Charlie, I said. Buenas noches, cabron. Lose something, Charlie? Charlie was utterly humiliated, but he didn't lose his composure. One of these nights, he said. Then he got up and walked out the bunkhouse. We heard him say something to Tex and Bruce, and I went to the window and watched as they walked to the gate. Crockett got to his feet and stretched. Let's head down to the main house and make some coffee. 'Bout time we had a little powwow. It was clear that we had pushed Charlie to his limit. Up until then, the rules of the game had dictated a certain bizarre etiquette that we'd all adhered to. But Charlie's karma was turning. It had started to turn from the day he met Crockett. Charlie could not get to Crockett. Charlie needed the paranoia of the city to work his fear tactics. In the desert, Crockett was on home ground, amid surroundings which were a part of his consciousness. Before, there had been no doubts. Charlie's belief in his destiny had been reinforced by an entire family of followers. 2 months had passed since the Tate LaBianca murders, and still the law had nothing on him. They'd busted him for stolen vehicles, but could not hold him. This made Charlie strong, made Helter Skelter even more of a reality. It validated Charlie's power. The fact that people had actually gone out and committed murder for him was proof of that power. Proof that his revolution, despite all odds, was meant to be, and that it was beyond the law. Then Crockett appeared and the family began to disintegrate. Charlie sought to beat Crockett at his own game, but without success. He could not discredit the man. Maybe Charlie was wrong. Maybe Crockett actually had more knowledge than he did. If that were the case, then perhaps Charlie had created a myth. He had killed for nothing. Maybe Helter Skelter wasn't real. That's when Charlie began to doubt himself. And that's when his karma turned, and he grew desperate. Though we didn't know it at the time, Charlie's rampages in the desert had begun to reflect his frustrations. Just days before his nocturnal visits to us, he and Clem and Tex set fire to a construction site and several pieces of large earth-moving equipment. A sure way to bring the man down on them. Crockett had sensed the dangers, but had no intention of letting someone drive him away from the canyon. He had also been curious to play out his hand with Charlie. Until that night. Seems to me, he said, once we were seated around the table with our coffee, that things are getting a little out of hand. What's nice about being here is the peace of mind, but there don't seem to be much of that left. More like the city up here now. Old Charlie brought helter-skelter with him, but I hate like hell to pull out. Just when we're having success with our prospecting and finding that other stuff. Juan picked up a shotgun and walked to the door. I don't stay, he said. I'm going back. He walked out onto the porch. We took our coffee and joined him, sitting on the steps. The night was cold, studded with stars, but there was enough light to see the craggy spine of the Panamints cutting sharply across the sky. We'll give it one more week, Crockett said. Make one more supply run. We can't stay too much longer, 'cause the cops are gonna swarm this place. I can feel it. The following morning, Juan and I set out for Las Vegas. The trip took 6 hours. Most of it was made in silence. Several times I tried to engage Juan in conversation, but he wasn't in the mood to talk. He said only that he planned to return to Spawn's and to pick up his back pay from George. And after that, he confessed he didn't know what he was going to do. Maybe when you and Brooks and Crockett find a good mine, I come and work with you. But I don't come back to Barker Ranch. No more. I let Juan out on the outskirts of Las Vegas. While he hitchhiked south toward Baker, I drove on into town. It took 3 days to get supplies, round up parts for my BSA, and deliver a couple of messages for Crockett. By noon on the 4th day, I was on my way back. Like Juan, I too thought of leaving. Charlie's terror tactics, even though they had backfired, had transformed our quiet, productive scene into a perverse kind of torture. I had gained a certain satisfaction in seeing Charlie's interaction with Crockett, since it reinforced my withdrawal from the family and served to convince me I had made a wise decision. But I knew Charlie couldn't and wouldn't be pushed much farther. His own credibility was on the line. There was too much at stake. Had I known just how much, I never would have returned that afternoon. By the time I parked the truck at Barker's, it was too late to carry in the supplies, so I left everything and hiked back up to the ranch. When I got there, all the lights in the ranch house were on. I saw Snake and Squeaky walking up the path to the house. 2 dirt bikes were parked at the gate and 3 or 4 dune buggies beyond the bunkhouse. Clem and Bruce Davis were sitting beside Brenda when I opened the gate. I saw Sadie coming down the road from the Myers place with Weish and Kitty Lutsinger, one of Bobby's old girlfriends. As I reached the porch, I spotted 2 of the girls getting out of the bus, followed by Tex and Bill Vance, who had driven a new dune buggy up the back route by way of Furnace Creek. My heart was pounding as I walked into the house. Charlie sat at the table across from Snake. Katie was cutting Snake's hair. Snake smiled, but she looked ghostly. She laughed nervously when I sat down. "Glad you're back, brother," Charlie said, getting to his feet and stretching his arms over his head. "Where's Brooks and Crockett?" "Don't know." Charlie walked past me to the door. "But I gotta dig a couple of graves before it gets dark." He let the door slam as he walked out. Fear, rage, utter desperation commingled inside me. Tex came in with a shotgun and sat down at the table. Then Squeaky, Sandy, and Brenda entered the house. All had short, uneven, recently cut hair. The sound of the scissors slicing through Snake's hair sent chills down my back. Bruce came in and sat down across from me. His face was red and puffy. Some of the sores on his arms had healed, but new ones had erupted on his neck, just under his chin. "Where's that Panamanian piggy?" he rasped. Before I could respond, Charlie called to him from the porch and he walked out. I got up, went into the bathroom, and closed the door. I had to compose myself. I had to face Charlie without blowing it. I heard him and Bruce walk past the house. I heard Bruce's coarse, pneumatic laugh as I started to take a piss. Then I heard Charlie speaking to Phil Sims, an ex-con and a friend of Charlie's who had apparently just arrived. "How's your wife, Jean?" Charlie wanted to know. "Real pain in the ass at the moment. You know how women are." "Well," Charlie blurted, his voice hard and without a trace of humor, "why don't you bring her up here, and we'll throw her down a mine shaft? Then you can move in with us." I didn't wait for Phil's reply, but went back into the living room. Katie, Stephanie, and Cappy were in the kitchen preparing a meal. Cappy said, "Hi, Paul," as I paused, past the kitchen doorway, and took a seat by the table, just as Charlie and Bruce walked in from the porch and sat down. In addition to Charlie and Bruce, there were two other males seated at the table. A kid they called Zero, and a part-time wrangler from Spawns named Larry Jones. There were also two new girls, introduced to me as Beth and Shelley. With his family slowly disintegrating around him, Charlie felt the need of recruiting additional followers. But I paid little attention to any of them. All my focus was on Charlie. He grinned at me. "Let's make a little music." His eyes were dancing. I knew it was test time and sensed as I held his gaze that what lay in the balance was everything. While he tuned the guitar, he told me that the tapes we'd made at Spawns were sent to be recorded, and that an LP record would soon be released. He said it was long overdue, but our hard work would pay off. I put all my attention on Charlie, on the music. I listened to the sounds he made on the guitar. Then he sang, and I sang with him, and it was like one sound. Afterward, he came back over and put his arm around me. "You're finally back, huh? Where you belong. It's about time." We ate a huge meal together that night. Then the girls moved the table and chairs and brought in mattresses and laid them on the floor. Tex built a fire, and we all gathered around Charlie to make music. I sensed that it was all a means of showing me that the family was still unified, that the love was still there, that we were still one. But going through the motions was not enough. The people sitting around me, Snake on my left, Brenda on my right, then Katie, Sadie, Stephanie, Weish, Cappy, Tex, Kitty, Bill Vance, Crazy Patty, Sandy, Clem, and Squeaky, seemed lifeless. With their close-cropped hair, the girls looked like a gaggle of militant dykes. There was no feeling. There was only a strange, depraved momentum set in motion by Charlie. When I looked at Snake, I felt sick inside. Her eyes were glassy and lusterless. She looked insane. When Charlie made a joke, everyone laughed. Yet the laughter was soulless and without joy. At times I found the girls looking at me as though I were a stranger, or perhaps someone they had seen before, but could not quite remember. Still, there had been a connection, however vague and nostalgic, and I felt it. I also felt Charlie's attention on me, particularly after he began to play the guitar. Like the others, I went through the motions. We were getting ready to drop acid when Bruce Davis came stumbling into the room to announce that the truck was stuck in the wash. Charlie flew into a rage. "Motherfucker!" he shouted. Can't you do anything without someone holding your hand? I might as well send a girl to drive the truck. We gotta drop off that gasoline and get supplies. I can get the truck out, Charlie, I said. Charlie's eyes found mine. He got to his feet and walked across the room, muttering to himself. Yeah, he said finally. Why don't you do that? Deliver them gas drums and pick up supplies. Then come back here. You go too, he said to Bruce. Make sure everything gets back safe and sound. Everything. Bruce nodded. Charlie was taking a chance, yet he probably saw it as an opportunity to teach Bruce a lesson while testing me at the same time. In a way, it was a continuation of the power games he had been playing with Crockett. With Crockett gone, he may have considered his position stronger. He knew that Bruce, having assumed my position within the family, would keep a close eye on me. Charlie went into the bedroom and came out with a wad of folded bills, which he laid in my hand. Here's $300. Buy some camping gear and a couple of parachutes. Then play the slot machines for me. Okay? I interpreted this gesture as a vote of confidence and a means of castigating Bruce. Less than a week before, I had been on Charlie's shit list. Now, he was entrusting me with money and responsibility for supplies. He was also, he believed, securing an implied agreement from me to return. My plan at that point was simple: to get the truck unstuck, get to Vegas, and start looking for Brooks and Crockett. I had a growing sense that they were safe, and I wasn't that worried about Bruce Davis. Charlie walked with us down to the gate, Bruce on one side, me on the other. For a long moment we stood in silence, looking down the road that leads to Goler Wash. Charlie lit a cigarette and exhaled into the chill night air. I was aware of a low rumbling sound that seemed to seep up out of the canyon. The same psychic vibration that preceded Charlie's arrival at Barker's just weeks before. I had an impulse to ask Charlie and Bruce if they heard a sound, but thought better of it. Even then, I knew what that sound was. It was a sound Brooks and Crockett and I heard a week earlier. The sound of the man closing in. As I stood beside Charlie listening to his final instructions to Bruce, I recalled the words he had spoken to me at Gresham Street over 6 months before. You know, once Helter Skelter comes down, I'll be going back to the joint. After that, it'll be up to you. It was after 3 a.m. by the time we got the truck out and drove it to the base of the wash. I told Bruce to stop while I lifted my BSA out of the pickup. Without a word, he helped me load it into the flatbed. Then we headed out across the valley toward Ballarat to deliver Charlie's gas drums and continue on to Las Vegas. Bruce did a lot of talking on that trip. He told me about going to London and studying Scientology. He told me Helter Skelter would stun the world. He also told me something I'd heard before: how hard it had been to kill Shorty Shea. Once we got to Vegas, I ditched Bruce long enough to make a phone call to Shoshone. I spoke to Don Ward. When I asked if he knew where Crockett and Poston were, he said, maybe, but we gotta talk to make sure who you are. The next day, I unloaded my bike and drove it to Shoshone. Brooks Poston and Paul Crockett were in Don Ward's office when I got there. The following morning, the Barker Ranch was busted. Part 4. The truth will set you free. Chapter 23. Leaving the family that night with Bruce for what I thought to be the last time did not break my ties with Charlie. Even after he went to LA County Jail as a murder suspect. On the contrary, and for a variety of reasons, not the least of which, perhaps, was Charlie's physical absence, I was drawn back to the family. Charlie's powers, though he was behind bars, did not diminish. For months, he would manipulate not only a large segment of the public and mass media, but also law enforcement officials, lawyers, even judges. He also managed to hold the family together. Unwittingly, I helped him. He had attempted to program me for this long before. When Helter Skelter comes down, I'll be back in the joint. It'll be up to you. While my motives were never completely clear, being at times as much subconscious as conscious, my actions did serve, as Crockett put it, to hold the family together when you should just let it die. I continued to work with Crockett and Brooks, but I was divided within myself. I can honestly say that no time in my life was more agonizing than the months between Charlie's capture and his conviction. I walked a mighty thin line. The view from the middle often gives a panorama of all sides. But my balance was precarious at best, and what I paid for that vantage point in suffering was more than I could afford. That I survived at all appears, in retrospect, something of a miracle. The hillsides around Shoshone are riddled with man-made caves, dug originally by itinerant miners, prospectors, and other vagabonds who, over the years, found the town a convenient oasis in the scorching lowlands of the Amargosa Valley. Shoshone was also on the railroad line and for a time the site of a thriving hobo jungle, which centered in and around the Tufa Caves. Crockett and Poston were broke and living in one of those caves when I arrived on October 9th. Don Ward had told them, as he told me, not to leave Shoshone, that the Barker Ranch was about to be busted. The following day, just before dawn, while the three of us slept off a reunion celebration on the floor of the cave, officers from the Highway Patrol, the Inyo County Sheriff's Office, and the National Park Rangers assembled near Goler Wash for a raid on the Barker Ranch. A raid that lasted 3 days and resulted in the capture of Charlie and most of the family. All were taken to Inyo County seat in Independence, just 4 hours north of Shoshone, and booked for auto theft. I didn't know then, nor did Brooks or Crockett, that during the raid, Stephanie Schramm and Kitty Lutzinger, Bobby Beausoleil's girlfriend, who was then 5 months pregnant with his child, had been trying to escape from the family. They asked the police for protection, and they were taken to Independence to be interviewed by detectives. When it was learned that Kitty was Bobby's girlfriend, she was asked what she knew about the Hidman murder. She said she had heard that Manson had sent Bobby and a girl named Susan Atkins to Hidman's house to collect some money, and that when he refused to pay, they had killed him. On October 13th, Brooks, Crockett, and I were escorted to Independence by Don Ward and the officers of the Highway Patrol. Brooks and Paul had already made statements to law enforcement officials, including Ward, as to the nature of goings-on at the Barker Ranch. They had talked about Charlie's philosophy and Helter Skelter. The law, however, at that point appeared little interested in such bizarre and unlikely tales. The primary concern, it seemed, at least on the surface, was that Manson and the others be identified and linked to the stolen vehicles found at the ranch. We were shown photographs of dune buggies and Harleys and asked to identify them. We did. both privately to Dave Stuber of the Highway Patrol and later that week during Charlie's preliminary hearing in the Inyo County Courthouse. But during that hearing, things changed drastically. One morning, flocks of reporters appeared in the courtroom. Not only LA and local press, but foreign correspondents as well. What had started out as a quiet routine procedure became suddenly a circus of spectators, reporters, cops, and lawyers. Word was out that this was not a simple case of auto theft. Charles Manson had become a murder suspect. Independence, though it's the seat of Inyo County, is a small, immaculate town in the heart of the Owens Valley at the foot of the eastern Sierras. From the center of the main drag, snow-capped peaks are visible year-round. The county itself is the second largest in the state, but has fewer than 17,000 inhabitants. During the court proceedings, it seemed as though all of them had flocked to Independence. I remember Crockett saying one morning, "Jesus, there just ain't no place to hide." Everywhere we went, we were hounded by reporters. Crockett told us to keep quiet and let things blow over a little. But that didn't happen. It just got more intense. Finally, one morning, while we were drinking coffee in a waiting room outside the courthouse, Crockett said it was time we took some of the story to the press. "Look at it this way," he said. "Old Charlie always wanted his story told. We might as well tell it. It ain't all pretty, but it needs to be told. People should know what the hell went on, what can happen to the mind. Most people ain't gonna believe it anyway, but eventually there's gonna be a lot said about it. Hell, there's gonna be books written about it." Another of Crockett's motives, though he didn't express it at the time, was money. We were stone broke. We couldn't go back to the mine. Police had made Goler Wash a restricted area. Meanwhile, foreign correspondents were clamoring for information. The more we refused to talk, the more they wanted to make a deal for our story. 2 days before leaving Independence, we agreed to meet in LA and give it to them. Around the middle of November, at approximately the same time Sadie was at Sybil Brand Penitentiary for Women, telling her story to Ronnie Howard, Juan, Brooks, Crockett, and I met with reporters, Don Dornan, Ivor Davis, and Jerry LeBlanc, in Sherman Oaks, and told them what we knew about the Manson family, including the murder of Gary Hinman, and what we'd heard regarding Shorty's death. The interviews lasted 5 days and resulted in the publication of articles in both Spain and Germany, as well as a book, which we did not agree to, that was later released, called 5 to Die. We were paid $1,100 each for our information. Afterward, Crockett, Brooks, and I went back to Shoshone, while Juan remained in LA. It was a scary time for us. Word had it that Charlie had issued more threats. Most of the family, including Clem and Bruce, had been released from Inyo County and were back in LA, living at Spawn's. Our own living conditions in the cave were no means pleasant. Without electricity or water, we were forced to use candles and to transport water a mile up the mountain from Shoshone in 5-gallon containers. Since Goler Canyon was off limits, we could not go to the mine, and we had to find work in Shoshone. I managed to get hired washing dishes in the Shoshone Cafe, and also worked with Brooks and Crockett doing town maintenance for the Charles Brown Company. We worked our asses off, did everything, trimmed trees, painted buildings, laid concrete, dug ditches, pumped cesspools. In late November, we moved out of the cave and rented a house on the main highway across the street from the high school football field. It was a small place, 2 bedrooms, a tiny, narrow kitchen, and a fair-sized living room. There was also a small fireplace, which became essential as weather turned colder in winter. In front of it, Crockett set up his table, and at nights after work, while we practiced our music, he spent hours playing solitaire. Around Christmas time, Juan Flynn moved in with us. By then, Charlie, Sadie, and Leslie had been charged with murder and indicted. Katie and Tex were still out of the state. Juan brought us further news. Others associated with the Manson family had reportedly been killed. One of them was Joel Dean Pugh, Sandra Good's ex-husband. The other, a young man I'd met only 2 months before, John Philip Hott, better known as Zero. Shoshone was far from mellow for any of us. People didn't take to ex-Manson family members living in their midst, particularly after the story in the LA Times, Susan Atkins' story of 2 nights of murder. Notices were posted advising that people keep their children, particularly their young daughters, under lock and key while we were in town. Petitions were circulated to have us removed. Letters were sent to the district attorney. Being glared at, ignored, and verbally berated became a part of our daily experience. And while, in time, it lessened somewhat, it never stopped completely. The only saving grace was that Don Ward, one of the few people who sought to understand the dynamics of the Manson family, became our friend, and to some extent served as a buffer between us and the public at large. Sometime around Christmas, shortly after Charlie had been granted the right to defend himself, I felt the urge to go to LA and see the family. I don't know if it was a programmed response, an implant Charlie had made months before, curiosity, guilt, or a perverse sense of my own confusion. I don't know what it was, but I did miss the family and still considered many of its members my friends. When I told Crockett, he said it didn't surprise him. He said it would take a long time to get free of Charlie's programs and my ties to the family, and that I wouldn't ever do it by avoiding the issue. I'd read newspaper accounts, and I'd listened to Juan. I could well imagine the paranoia at Spawn's. But I wanted to see for myself. I wanted to see Charlie. I wanted to see the others. And at a deeper level, I wanted to extricate some meaning from all the horror and carnage, to step back into the nightmare and find something worth salvaging. When I asked Juan if he'd heard anything about Snake, he said he had. They sent her to mental hospital. The first thing I did when I got to LA was call Patton State Hospital. They said Diane Lake was there, but I couldn't see her. Afterward, I went directly to the Los Angeles County Jail to see Charlie. The meeting was arranged by Charlie's lawyer, Dae Shin, who escorted me to the small glass-enclosed room where we both waited. Moments later, Charlie came in, all smiles, clean-shaven and wearing his blue jumpsuit prison garb. "Hey, brother, hey, where you been?" He gave me a hug and grinned at Dae Shin. "This is the man I've been waiting for," he said. "How's things, Charlie?" He shrugged. "I'm just here for Christmas." He winked at Dae Shin. "I always come home for Christmas." Charlie lit a cigarette and pulled the ashtray in front of him. "Lot to do," he said. "The girls need your help, you know. All this legal shit to attend to. They got a place on Chandler Street in Van Nuys. Got the scene going at Spawn's, too. We're getting the album out. You gotta help 'em out. Keep things together." Listening to Charlie rap, you'd have thought he was free. He spoke as though nothing had changed, and that being in prison for murder was merely a temporary inconvenience. He was, in fact, in excellent spirits. Overnight, he'd become an internationally known figure. He'd made the cover of Life magazine. There was also a small yet vocal segment of radicals who were calling him a hero. My impulse was to ask him about the Tate LaBianca murders, but with Day Shin sitting beside me, I remained silent. "What you been doing?" he finally asked me. Before I could reply, he went on, "You still with Crockett?" I nodded. "Hey, tell me something. Does he try? I mean, psychic energy. Does he try, or does it just happen? I mean, I sit in my cell and put all my attention on the bars to make them dissolve. But they won't do it, They won't do it because I try." I told Charlie that Crockett didn't try. I realized even then how dangerous a game I was playing. You can't be on all sides at once. Yet, that's what I was doing. I was with Crockett. I was also with those who sought to prosecute Charles Manson. Along with Brooks and Juan, I had told the DA and other cops all I knew about the family. Yet, when Charlie asked what I'd said to the law, I didn't lie. "We're just telling your story, Charlie. Just telling it like it is. 'Cause your story has to be told. The true story." "Dig it," Charlie quipped, glancing at Shin. "The truth will set you free. Even Crockett will tell you that." What struck me then, and continued to amaze me during subsequent trips with Charlie, was his preoccupation with Crockett. Invariably, he would ask about my relationship to him, and if he had taught me anything, I might pass along. I told Charlie that if I could think of anything, I'd let him know. After leaving the jail, I drove directly to Spawn's ranch in a battered Chevy pickup I'd borrowed from a friend of Juan's. As I wound my way up Santa Susana Pass in second gear, I flashed on all the journeys I'd made on that road with Charlie and the family. Of the day Brenda and Snake had first taken me there. All that had transpired since then seemed beyond comprehension. I felt apprehensive as I turned into the driveway. On the surface, things hadn't changed. George and Pearl were still there. So was Randy. Gypsy and Squeaky continued to minister to George's needs. The Wranglers worked. The tourists came and went. So did the law. The paranoia Juan spoke about was all too apparent. Driving up to the boardwalk was almost eerie. Squeaky, Brenda, Sandy, and Clem were standing by the saloon when I pulled in. While Clem, as usual, was pretty spaced out, the girls seemed alert and animated. They greeted me with open arms. "Charlie said you'd be back," Brenda said, beaming. I spent the afternoon at Spawn's. I saw George and Pearl, and then took a walk up to the outlaw shacks. I watched the Wranglers herding horses toward the corral. I thought of the first summer at Spawn's when things had been good. I thought of Shorty Shay. That night I went with the family, or what remained of it, Squeaky, Brenda, Gypsy, Sandy, Clem, and a kid named Kevin, to the Chandler Street house in Van Nuys. On the way, Squeaky told me about the trial, about Leslie, Katie, and Sadie. She said things were working out well, that Charlie would handle his own defense and that he would get off. She also said that the album was being cut in wax. It would soon be released. The Chandler Street house was a 2-bedroom, 2-bath structure in the center of an upper-middle-class residential area in Van Nuys. The property was surrounded by a thick hedge on one side and a chain-link fence on the other. There was an outdoor patio in the back where we convened to discuss legal matters, entertain reporters, and play music. The living room was cluttered with amplifiers and musical instruments, but was otherwise orderly. At that time, the family had 3 vehicles, 2 of which were parked out in front of the house. A late model Volkswagen van belonging to another new guy named Mark Ross, and an old Studebaker sedan. There was also a pickup truck, which was kept at Spawn's. My return to the family changed the nature of things immediately. If the girls harbored any suspicions as to my loyalty, they didn't show it. I was needed. The Manson family was based on male leadership. Charlie's absence had created a real void, a void Clem, and later Bruce Davis, would never be able to fill, nor the young recruits like Mark and Kevin who began hanging around after the arrests. Unconsciously, I fell into the role at once. While Squeaky continued to brief me on all the legal issues, who needed what, which lawyers had to be fired or hired, I began instituting my own programs, a return to the original philosophy of being unified in love and music. It was completely insane. Charlie was on trial for mass murder. Deep down, I was coming to believe he was guilty of those murders. Yet, there I was, working with the girls on Charlie's behalf in court, while trying to regain some semblance of what the family had once been. All of which seemed fine with Charlie, since the image he was then trying to project to the public was that of the enlightened hippie guru who had become the victim of a degenerate society. When I called Crockett and told him I was moving in with the family, there was a long and pregnant silence on his end. Crockett never gave advice. He didn't then. He merely quoted something from the Bible. Fools go where angels fear to tread. To this day, I don't know just what forces were impelling me. I was later accused of being a spy for the police, but this was never the case. In part, it was the fulfillment of my role in the family. Charlie had said, "I am you and you are me." That statement was always more applicable to me than to anyone else. He had also said, "Someday you'll be taking over." Too, I may have been motivated by a sense of guilt for having deserted the family. Not just Charlie, but everyone. I wanted to get back to what we once had. Perhaps with Charlie gone there was a chance, but I knew that this was a false hope. Charlie was never gone from the minds of his followers. Though there were times when I realized how much danger I was in, I could not let go. That is the power of programming and what this book is about. When I saw Juan in LA several days later and told him what was happening, he said I was crazy. Seemed to me like you try and commit suicide. By that time, Crockett, Brooks, and I had all made statements to the DA's investigators. This information I knew would be turned over to Charlie once a motion for discovery was made for by the defense, which means that all evidence of the prosecution, documents, reports, interviews, everything, has to be submitted to the defense for examination. Charlie would see at once that my testimony against him was some of the most damaging, particularly what he had told me about killing Shorty Shea. Even so, there was a part of me which believed that Charlie would realize the wisdom of his own words. The truth will set you free. That by telling the truth, I was doing him a favor. Admitting this now is not easy. Admitting to being a fool never is. But it was not merely a process in which I had been locked up for more than a year and which had left me completely fragmented. The power of programming, hypnosis, call it what you will. I was telling the truth. But I was telling it differently to different people. To Crockett, to the police, to the family. In the face of all the horror, the real truth, I turned my head. It was not a question of personality, character, or reason. It was like being a victim of a destiny I had to trust. I did know one thing. It couldn't go on indefinitely. For the next few weeks, I met with Charlie, discussed strategy, helped the girls secure new lawyers. I spoke to Sadie and Leslie and conveyed Charlie's messages. Meanwhile, at the Chandler Street house, I reinstituted therapy sessions and love therapy and began indoctrinating the new guys in the arts of sex. For a time, I did become Charlie in a way that I never had before. Perhaps, unconsciously, I was proving that I could do in the family what Charlie had done in the beginning. And by doing it, that it wasn't such a great achievement. In some sense, this would invalidate Charlie, or at least prove to me that the programs I had accepted were not so important. Perhaps I was trying to free myself by walking a tightrope in front of Charlie's nose, playing his game even better than he had played it. By the end of January 1970, the only thing I hadn't done was to make love to Squeaky, Charlie's number one girl. I sensed that some of the other girls were generating pressure in that direction. Only at night did my anxieties really surface. I began suffering from acute insomnia. When I did sleep, I'd invariably have nightmares. I fell into a habit, both at Spawn's and sometimes at the Chandler Street house, of walking all night, alone. Only through total exhaustion could I relieve some of the tension. But I couldn't go on living like that, and I knew it. One morning, the day after I'd been told that Charlie had warned the girls to watch Paul, I returned from Spawn's following an all-night hike. Though totally thrashed, I borrowed Mark Ross's camper and drove it out to Topanga Canyon. I felt the need to see the ocean. Near the base of the canyon, just before it enters the coast highway, I stopped to buy a cup of coffee. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw a guy get out of his van and trot across the street toward the gas station. He looked familiar, but I wasn't sure. I rolled down my window and shouted, "Hey, Charlie! Blackbeard Charlie!